Happy New Year! Let's kick off 2025 with a Batman story. Why? Well, I kind of ended up creating a tradition of making a video on a Batman focused story at the start of the calendar year and not making another one throughout the rest of it. Those are from shared titles with Superman. That is a movie. That is an alternate universe story about a kid who loved Batman and ended up manifesting a Batman-like entity that may have been a combination of his deceased brother and the trauma of losing his parents. Okay, I think this gag has gone on long enough. And that's probably the only joke I'll be making, as the story I'm covering, Batman Night Cries, is one of the darkest Batman stories I've ever read. I mean, you've seen the video's title. And yes, while it is a bit clickbaity, this is on YouTube after all, it's not necessarily inaccurate. You see, there are often two broad categories of, let's say, evil that happen on the comic book page. On the one hand, you have Thanos killing half the universe in the Infinity Gauntlet, a truly horrifying act, but one most likely to be confined to the pages of a fictional story. Hell, when the movie came out, some people actually agreed with what the Mad Titan did, partially because they thought he was a cool and epic villain, and partially because they thought he had a point. Ignoring the fact that the thing Thanos does happen in real life, albeit on a smaller scale, most people just aren't capable of comprehending the scope of what such a thing would mean. It's just a comic book problem put forward by the villain for the heroes to solve. On the other hand, you have Hank Pym hitting his wife Janet while having a mental breakdown. The visual of a woman being hit by her husband isn't one that any sane person can rationalize as part of a comic book plot, as such actions are depressingly common in real life. A horrifying fictional reminder of a real world crime, which everyone is aware of, may know someone who went through it, or be potential victims themselves. So, that brings us back to Batman Night Cries, which is a case of the latter. And here's the part where I will be putting up another warning to turn back at any point in the video moving forward, as we will be touching on a few uncomfortable topics. Before we begin, some background on Batman Night Cries, which was written by Archie Goodwin and Scott Hampton, the latter also providing the artwork. Archie Goodwin might be a familiar name to comic fans, as he is probably best known for his editorial work at DC in the 90s, having edited well-known stories like The Long Halloween. However, this was his second stint at the company, having worked there previously in the 70s, where he edited a lot of DC's war comics, which is mildly important for Night Cries. As for Scott Hampton, he's probably best known for his painted art style, with one of his most notable works being the cult classic series Simon Dark. And hey, if you like his artwork, he's working on making Gregory Maguire's Wicked into a graphic novel, with a release date of around March 2025, so keep your eyes peeled for that if you're interested. The story of Batman Night Cries involves Commissioner Gordon investigating a series of brutal family murders in Gotham. Batman initially thinks that the murders are connected to a new drug being introduced on the streets, especially when he finds evidence that one of the victims was a rich man trying to get into the drug trade. However, Gordon later finds evidence in the first murder indicating that the kid died earlier than his parents, implying that they were the ones who killed him. This, combined with the testimony of a survivor from a third murder, confirms to both Gordon and Batman that the killer is a vigilante targeting parents mistreating their kids. While this wouldn't be the only Batman story that deals with such sensitive topics, what makes this story stand out a lot more is the subplot about Jim Gordon. We learn that Jim's father used to beat him when he was a kid, something that clearly affects him to this day. It's why he insists on calling his son, James Gordon Jr., by his first name instead of Jimmy, which is the nickname his father used to call him. Now, the kid's mother, Barbara, doesn't agree with that. However, as Jim only told her that he hates that name and not the reason, she doesn't know the full story. And we see the effects of Gordon's childhood trauma throughout the entire story as he has to deal with the stresses of a job where he has to kiss the asses of the toadies of powerful people, while also dealing with the corruption and occasional incompetence of those under his charge. While his wife and some others don't see why he needs to go so far, Gordon understands that if he doesn't work as hard as he does, even with Batman's help, a lot of crimes will just be swept under the rug. Even his showing up at a crime scene is enough to shake some of them into doing the bare minimum. But then again, this is after Gordon's affair with Sarah Essen, which also happened as a result of all those work problems. So Barbara is just as much in the right when she struggles to empathize with Gordon's work issues, especially since they led to him cheating on her in the past. But of course, the worst victim of all this is James Gordon Jr., who at one point picks up his dad's gun when he thinks a bad man is shouting at his mom. But something even worse happens later on. When Jim dozes off out of stress and remembers his father's actions, his son playfully tries to show him his new action figure. And Jim loses his mind and nearly lays hands on his kid until he sees exactly what he's about to do. This causes Jim to realize that he needs help, and he and his wife separate, with James Gordon Jr. going with her. Of course, if you are reading this for the first time after having read a lot of modern Batman comics like, say, The Black Mirror, you'll probably feel a sense of tragic inevitability as James Gordon does become a serial killer in the comics, repeating the tragedy of abused children going on to become abusers. Yes, this probably isn't due to Jim Gordon's actions, as this story may not have even been canon post Infinite Crisis when Junior's new backstory is revealed, but it isn't as if it might not be a factor. There's also a subplot about Batman being a potential suspect in the murders to the point that it even makes the blurb. However, within the story, this accusation doesn't have much impact. We know that Batman is innocent, and Gordon knows that he was out fighting drug dealers when one of the murders was happening. The resolution of this subplot happens when one of the victims, who had screamed in terror on seeing Batman, helps identify what had actually scared her after he unmasks to show her that he isn't the person who killed her parents. As a matter of fact, the only person who brings up the fact that Batman is a suspect is later revealed to have been the killer in the first place. This is where we get to the part of the story that's a bit contrived. As a way to kind of justify Batman being a suspect, it is revealed that the killer was part of a covert operation called the Vampires and would paint his face like a bat on his nightly excursions. Yes, it is slightly forced, but here's where Archie Goodwin's talent at depicting the horrors of war come into play, as reading this part kept me immersed and didn't break my suspension of disbelief. Finally, the art, which is amazing and immediately brings a serious house on a serious earth to mind. But if I can bring attention to more obscure titles, I should do that. And I have to highlight Batman Gotham County line as well as the previously mentioned Simon Dark, both of which have also art by Scott Hampton. As for this series, the art works really well to depict a sense of lost innocence, which is best on display in the scenes where any children show up, which tend to be brighter in sharp contrast to the rest of the comic. And that's Batman Night Cries. No supervillains, no over the top theatrics. Well, as much as you can say that in a world where a man dresses up like a bat to fight crime. And a take on real world issues that were handled in a relatively mature manner. The story also has canon relevance, as Jim and his wife would separate here and wouldn't return to the comics for years. It was implied that she and James Gordon Jr. had died in a car accident, but if that was ever canon, it didn't matter because it was eventually retconned. Jim would even reunite with Sarah Essen and have a long, if sometimes tumultuous, relationship with her. Until she died at the end of No Man's Land. But that's a story for another time.
New look? A sidekick? Do you mind if I ask you?
As a matter of fact, I do. Let's just say I set out to scare criminals, not children.
Fair enough.